He hadn't eaten in 2 days. They put him up for sale. The noon sun beat down on the dusty main street of Dry Creek, turning the air into a shimmering haze. A small crowd had gathered in front of the sheriff's office, their voices low, their eyes fixed on the crude wooden platform in the center of the square. On that platform stood a boy, no more than 10, barefoot, ribs showing through a torn shirt. His face was streaked with dust, but his eyes were stubborn, defiant, even as they darted toward the bundle in his arms. The bundle moved, coughed. It was a baby girl swaddled in a feed sack, her tiny chest rising and falling in the shallow, fragile breaths. The sheriff's voice cut through the murmurs. Caught him stealing bread from Miller's store. Says it was for the baby. Law says he works off the debt, or someone pays it. A man in the crowd spat into the dirt. Ain't worth the trouble, scrawny as a fence post. The boy's jaw tightened. He shifted the baby in his arms, shielding her from the sun with his own body. "She's my sister," he said, his voice hoarse but steady. "You can take me, but you leave her be." The sheriff ignored him. "Starting bid, $5 for the boy's labor. Comes with the girl if you want her." A ripple of uneasy laughter moved through the crowd. The boy's grip on his sister tightened. She coughed again, a thin, rattling sound that made him flinch. From the back of the crowd, a voice spoke, deep, calm, carrying over the noise. $10. Heads turned. A tall man in a weathered hat stepped forward, his coat dusty from the trail. His eyes were steady, unreadable. The boy stared at him, unsure if this was salvation or just another kind of prison. The sheriff smirked. "Sold?" The man climbed the platform, looking down at the boy. "Name's Carter. I've got a ranch west of here. You're coming with me." The boy didn't move. "What about my sister?" Carter's gaze shifted to the tiny bundle. "Both of you." The boy's defiance faltered for the first time. He didn't know this man, didn't trust him. But as Carter reached out a calloused hand, the boy realized something. No one else had offered to take them both. And in the Wild West, sometimes you had to gamble on the only hand you were dealt. The sheriff's office faded into the dust behind them, swallowed by the shimmering heat of the plains. Carter's wagon creaked and groaned as it rolled west, the horse's hooves thudding in a steady rhythm. The boy sat on the worn bench beside him, clutching his sister so tightly it was as if the wind might snatch her away. Carter didn't speak at first. He kept his eyes on the trail, his weathered hands loose on the reins. The boy's stomach growled, loud enough to be heard over the wagon wheels. Carter reached into a saddlebag and pulled out a small cloth bundle. Inside was half a biscuit, dry but fresh enough. "For you," he said, holding it out. The boy hesitated, his eyes narrowing. "What about her?" Carter nodded toward a canteen at his feet. "We'll stop soon. She needs water more than bread." The boy took the biscuit, breaking it in half. He chewed slowly, then pressed the other half to his sister's lips, letting her gum at the crumbs. Carter watched from the corner of his eye, saying nothing. They rode for hours, the land stretching out in every direction, rolling grass, scattered cottonwoods, and the far-off shimmer of heat over the horizon. The boy's head kept turning, scanning the emptiness behind them. "You expecting someone?" Carter asked finally. The boy's voice was flat. "The man from the store. He said he'd make me pay double if he saw me again." Carter's jaw tightened. "He won't see you again." The boy didn't answer, but his grip on his sister eased just a little. By late afternoon, the sky had shifted, clouds gathering low and heavy, the smell of rain riding the wind. Carter pulled the wagon off the trail toward a shallow creek. "We'll water the horses here, and the baby." The boy knelt by the bank, cupping water into his sister's mouth. She coughed, then swallowed, her tiny fingers curling around his thumb. For the first time all day, the boy's shoulders dropped just slightly. Carter crouched beside them. "What's her name?" The boy hesitated. "Lydia. And yours?" "Evan." Carter nodded once, as if committing the names to memory. "All right, Evan. Let's get you both home before the rain hits." As they climbed back into the wagon, Evan glanced at the horizon. The clouds were darker now, but it wasn't just the storm that made his stomach twist. Somewhere deep down, he knew. Storms passed, but trouble had a way of finding you again, and he wasn't sure yet if this rancher was the kind of man who could keep it away. The rain caught them halfway up the ridge. It came in sudden slanting sheets, drumming on the wagon boards and soaking through Evan's shirt in seconds. Carter leaned forward, urging the horses on, his hat brim dripping. Through the curtain of rain, the land began to change. The flat, endless prairie giving way to a rise of dark pines and wind-bent oaks. And there, perched on the crest like it had been watching the land for 100 years, stood the ranch house. It wasn't grand, but it was solid. 2 stories of weathered timber, a wide porch wrapping around the front, and a stone chimney sending up a thin thread of smoke. The windows glowed faintly in the gray light, and for a moment Evan thought it looked almost safe. They rattled into the yard, the wagon wheels splashing through puddles. A dog, big, rangy, with a coat the color of dust, trotted out from under the porch, barking once before circling the wagon. Carter gave a low whistle, and the dog fell silent, tail wagging slow. "Inside," Carter said, hopping down and offering a hand. Evan ignored it, climbing down on his own, still clutching Lydia. The porch boards creaked under their weight. Carter pushed the door open, and warm air rolled out. The smell of wood smoke, coffee, and something baking. Inside, the light was golden, the fire in the hearth snapping and spitting. A woman stood near the stove, her sleeves rolled up, hair pinned back in a loose knot. She turned at the sound of the door, her eyes going first to Carter, then to the children. "Found them in town," Carter said simply. "They'll be staying here for a while." The woman's gaze lingered on Evan, not unkind, but searching, as if she could read the story he wasn't telling. "I'm Anna," she said softly. "You're safe here." Evan shifted his weight, unsure whether to believe her. Safe was a word he'd heard before, and it had never lasted. Anna took Lydia from his arms with a gentleness that made his throat tighten. "She's cold," Anna murmured, wrapping the baby in a quilt. "Sit by the fire, both of you. I'll get you something warm to eat." Evan sat stiffly on the edge of a chair, his eyes darting around the room. The shelves lined with books, the rifle above the mantel, the boots by the door. Everything here spoke of permanence, of a life rooted deep in the land. It was the kind of place trouble could find, and the kind of place trouble could ruin. Carter hung his coat by the door and poured himself a cup of coffee. "Storm will pass by morning," he said almost to himself. Then, glancing at Evan, "You'll sleep in the loft. Dog'll keep watch outside." Evan nodded, but his mind was already working, measuring the distance to the door, the sound of the rain, The weight of the man who had brought him here, he didn't know yet if Carter was a savior or just another kind of danger. But for tonight, with the fire warm and Lydia breathing softly in her sleep, he decided to stay. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the air sharp and clean, the grass jeweled with rain. Evan woke to the smell of coffee and the faint creak of floorboards below. The loft was small, just a narrow bed, a wool blanket, and a single window looking out over the pasture. From up here, the world seemed still, but stillness had never meant safety to him. He sat up slowly, careful not to wake Lydia, who was curled against his side, her tiny breaths warm on his arm. For a moment, he just watched her, the way her fingers twitched in sleep, the way her hair stuck to her forehead. Whatever happened next, he had to keep her safe. That was the only rule that mattered. Downstairs, Carter was already at the table, a ledger open in front of him. Anna moved between the stove and the counter, her hands quick and sure. She glanced up as Evan came down the ladder. "Morning," she said. "Sit, eat." A plate was set before him, eggs, bread, and a slice of ham so thick it made his mouth water. He hesitated, glancing at Carter, who gave a small nod. Evan ate in silence, but every bite felt like a bargain he didn't understand. After breakfast, Carter handed him a pair of worn boots and a coat that hung heavy on his shoulders. "You'll help me with the stock," he said. "Work's part of staying here." Evan followed him out to the barn, the dog padding alongside. The air was rich with the smell of hay and horses, the sound of hooves shifting in their stalls. Carter moved with quiet efficiency, checking tack, filling water troughs, pitching hay. Evan copied his movements, watching closely, trying to learn the rhythm. "You handle yourself all right," Carter said after a while. Evan shrugged. Had to. Carter didn't press, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of recognition, maybe even respect. By midday the sun was high, and the land stretched out in every direction like a painted canvas. Evan paused by the fence, looking toward the distant hills. That's when he saw it, a lone rider, far off, moving slow along the ridge, too far to make out a face, but close enough to stir the knot in his stomach. "Someone you know?" Carter asked, following his gaze. Evan shook his head quickly. No. But the truth was, he didn't know if it was someone from town or someone worse. That night, after Lydia was asleep, Evan lay awake in the loft, listening. The wind rattled the shutters. The dog barked once, then fell silent. Somewhere below, Carter's boots crossed the floor, slow and deliberate. A door opened, closed. Evan crept to the window. In the moonlight, he saw Carter out by the barn, speaking in low tones to a man on horseback. The man handed him something, a small, wrapped bundle, before riding off into the dark. Carter stood there for a long moment, the bundle in his hand, before tucking it into his coat and heading back inside. Evan slipped back into bed, his heart thudding. The ranch might have been the safest place he'd seen in years, but now he knew. Carter had secrets. The next day passed in a strange rhythm. Evan worked alongside Carter in the barn, mending a fence line that had been knocked loose in the storm. The sun was warm, the air smelled of pine and damp earth, and for a few hours it almost felt like the world beyond the ranch didn't exist. But Evan's mind kept circling back to what he'd seen the night before. Carter in the moonlight, speaking to that rider, the bundle changing hands. He hadn't told Anna. He wasn't sure if he should. By late afternoon, clouds began to gather again, heavy and low. Anna called them in early, saying the wind had a bite to it. Inside, the fire was already lit, casting long shadows across the walls. Lydia was on a blanket near the hearth, gurgling softly as she tried to grab at the fringe. Evan sat nearby, pretending to read one of the old books from the shelf, but his eyes kept drifting to the window. The dog was restless, pacing the porch, ears pricked toward the road. Then came the sound, faint at first, then louder. Hoofbeats, not the slow, steady gait of a neighbor passing by, but the urgent, uneven rhythm of a rider pushing hard. Carter was on his feet before the knock came. 3 sharp raps on the door. Anna froze, her hand tightening on the wooden spoon she'd been holding. Carter glanced at her, then at Evan. "Take your sister upstairs, now." Evan didn't argue. He scooped Lydia into his arms and climbed the loft ladder, his heart pounding. From the shadows above, he could see the door swing open. A man stood there, rain dripping from his hat brim, his coat dark with mud. His voice was low, but Evan caught fragments. "Looking for a boy. Came through town. Storekeeper says." Carter's reply was calm, almost bored. "Ain't seen anyone like that. Roads are empty after the storm." The man shifted, glancing past Carter into the room. "Mind if I look around?" Carter stepped forward, blocking the doorway. "I do mind." For a long moment, neither moved. Then the man gave a tight nod, turned, and mounted his horse. The sound of hoofbeats faded into the distance. Evan stayed crouched in the loft until Carter called up. "You can come down now." When he did, Carter was pouring himself a drink, his face unreadable. "That man won't be back," he said. "But if he is, you keep to the loft. Understand?" Evan nodded, but inside the questions were piling up. Who was that man? Why had Carter lied so easily? And what exactly had he gotten them both into? That night, the wind howled around the house, rattling the shutters. Evan lay awake, Lydia's small weight warm against his side, and thought about the road that had brought them here. He'd wanted safety, but safety, he was starting to realize, might come with a price. The morning after the knock, the ranch felt different. The air was still, the kind of stillness that made the hairs on the back of Evan's neck rise. Even the dog seemed uneasy, pacing the porch and staring toward the road as if it knew something was coming. Carter didn't speak much over breakfast. He moved with the same deliberate calm as always, but there was a tightness in his jaw, a watchfulness in his eyes. Anna noticed it too. Evan could tell by the way she kept glancing at him, as if waiting for him to say something that never came. By midday, the sky had turned a color of tarnished silver. Evan was in the barn brushing down one of the horses when he heard it, the faint, rhythmic thud of hooves. Not one rider this time. Several. He froze, the brush still in his hand. The sound grew louder, closer, until it filled the air like a drumbeat. Through the barn's open door, he saw them crest the rise. 4 riders, dark shapes against the pale sky, moving fast. Carter appeared in the doorway, his voice low but firm. "Evan, get your sister, now." Evan didn't argue. He ran for the house, his boots pounding the packed dirt. Inside, Anna was already wrapping Lydia in a blanket, her face pale but steady. "Upstairs," she said, "and stay quiet." From the loft window, Evan watched the riders pull into the yard. They dismounted in a spray of mud, their horses snorting, steam rising from their flanks. The man from the night before was among them, his eyes scanning the house like a hawk searching for prey. Carter stepped out onto the porch, his stance loose but ready. "Afternoon," he called, as if this were nothing more than a neighborly visit. The man didn't bother with pleasantries. "We know the boy's here. Storekeeper says he took something that wasn't his." Carter's voice was calm, but there was steel under it. "You're on my land. You'll leave now." One of the other men laughed, a short, ugly sound. "Or what? You'll shoot us in front of the lady and the kid?" Carter didn't answer. He just shifted his weight, and Evans saw the glint of the rifle leaning against the porch post. The standoff stretched, the air thick with the smell of wet earth and horse sweat. Then the man from the store took a step forward. "We're not leaving without him." Carter's voice dropped to something colder. "Then you're not leaving at all." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then, slowly, the riders backed toward their horses. The man from the store gave Carter a long, hard look. "This ain't over." They mounted up and rode off, the sound of their hooves fading into the distance. Evan let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. But Carter didn't relax. He stood there on the porch, watching the horizon long after the riders were gone. When he finally came inside, he looked straight at Evan. "You need to tell me everything, right now." And Evan knew, whatever came next, the truth was going to change everything. The house was quiet after the riders left, but it wasn't the kind of quiet that brought peace. It was the kind that sat heavy in the air, pressing down on every breath. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting the room in a restless dance of shadows. Carter stood by the window, one hand resting on the frame, his eyes fixed on the dark horizon. Evan sat at the table, Lydia asleep in his lap, her tiny hand curled around his thumb. Anna moved silently in the kitchen, the clink of a cup against a counter the only sound. Finally, Carter turned. "All right, Evan, no more half-truths. Tell me what happened before I found you in town." Evan's first instinct was to stay quiet. He'd learned long ago that words could be dangerous, that the wrong truth in the wrong ears could cost you everything. But Carter's gaze was steady, not demanding, just waiting. Evan looked down at Lydia, at the way her chest rose and fell in fragile rhythm. If he didn't speak now, the danger would keep following them. And maybe, just maybe, this man could help. "It started in the winter," Evan began, his voice low. "Pa left months before, said he was going to find work. Never came back. Ma got sick, real sick. She couldn't get out of bed. I tried to keep the fire going, tried to feed Lydia, but the food ran out." He swallowed hard, his throat tight. "I went to the store in town, asked Miller, the storekeeper, if I could work for bread. He laughed, said I was too small to be worth the trouble. I left, but—" Lydia was crying. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. "I went back that night and took a loaf from the shelf." His voice cracked, but he pushed on. "He caught me before I got to the door, hit me, said I was a thief, said I'd pay for it. Next morning the sheriff came, took me and Lydia, said they'd auction me off to work off the debt. Miller told him to sell us both if he could." Anna had stopped moving in the kitchen. She stood with her hands braced on the counter, her head bowed. Carter's face didn't change, but something in his eyes darkened. "That man today," Carter said quietly, "the one leading the riders, that was Miller?" Evan nodded. "He said he'd make me pay double if he saw me again. I think he wants Lydia, too. He said she'd fetch a price with the right family." The words hung in the air like smoke. Carter crossed the room and poured himself a drink, the amber liquid catching the firelight. He took a slow sip, then set the glass down. "You should know something, Evan. Men like Miller, they don't stop, not unless someone makes them." Evan frowned. "You sound like you know him." Carter's jaw tightened. "I know his kind. I've dealt with them before. Years ago, I had a neighbor, good man, family man. A cattle broker tried to cheat him out of his herd. When he refused, they burned his barn with him inside. That broker, he rode with Miller once." Evan's stomach twisted. "So you think he'll come back?" "I don't think, Evan. I know." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Anna came to the table, resting a hand on Evan's shoulder. "You're not alone anymore," she said softly. "Whatever comes, we face it together." Evan wanted to believe her, but he'd seen what happened to people who stood in the way of men like Miller. And now Carter's words made it clear. This wasn't just about a stolen loaf of bread anymore. This was about power, about a man who thought he could take whatever he wanted. Carter moved to the door, looking out into the night again. "Get some rest. Tomorrow we make preparations." "Preparations for what?" Evan asked. Carter's voice was calm, but it carried the weight of a promise. "For when Miller comes back, and this time he won't be leaving on his own terms." Evan sat there long after Carter had gone upstairs, the lamplight flickering over Lydia's sleeping face. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but for the first time he felt something he hadn't in a long while. Not safety, not yet, but the beginning of a fight worth standing for. The morning broke cold and pale, the kind of light that made the frost on the grass look like a thin layer of glass. Carter was already outside, tightening the cinch on his saddle. His breath came in slow clouds, his movements deliberate. Inside, Evan sat at the table, staring at the steam curling from his cup. Lydia was still asleep upstairs, Anna watching over her. The air felt different, not just tense, but decided. Today was the day. By mid-morning, the sound came. Hoofbeats, not hurried, not cautious, confident. The kind of rhythm that said the riders weren't here to talk. Carter stepped onto the porch, his rifle resting against the doorframe. Evan followed, his hands clenched at his sides. Miller rode at the front, his coat flapping in the wind, a smirk carved into his face like it had been there all his life. Behind him, 6 men fanned out, their eyes scanning the yard. "Morning, Carter," Miller called, his voice carrying easy in the cold air. "I hear you've been keeping something that belongs to me." Carter didn't move. "Boy's not yours. Neither is the girl." Miller chuckled. "Everything's for sale, Carter. You know that. Question is, do you want to sell or do I take?" Evan felt the heat rise in his chest. "You can't have her. You can't have either of us." Miller's gaze slid to him, slow and deliberate. "You've got a mouth on you, boy. Your pa had one too, if I recall. Didn't help him much." The words hit like a slap. Evan's fists tightened, but Carter's hand came up, not to stop him, but to steady him. "You got one chance to turn around, Miller," Carter said, his voice low but carrying. "You ride out now. You keep breathing. You stay." He let the rest hang in the air. Miller's smirk widened. "You always did think you were the law out here, but the law's whoever's left standing." The first shot cracked the air before anyone saw who fired. One of Miller's men jerked back in the saddle, clutching his arm. Carter's rifle was already leveled for the next shot. Chaos erupted. Horses reared, men shouted, gunfire split the morning. Evan dove for the woodpile, grabbing the small shotgun Carter had left there. He'd never fired at a man before, but when one of Miller's riders broke from the group and charged toward the porch, Evan's hands acted before his mind could catch up. The blast sent the man tumbling from his horse, the sound ringing in Evan's ears. Miller dismounted, using his horse as cover, firing toward the porch. Carter moved like a man who'd done this before, calm, precise, every shot counting. 2 more of Miller's men went down, the rest scattering for cover. Evan's heart pounded so hard it felt like it might break his ribs. He saw Miller moving along the fence line, trying to flank Carter. "Carter!" Evan shouted. Carter turned just as Miller raised his gun. The 2 shots came almost together. Miller's grazing Carter's shoulder, Carter's hitting Miller square in the chest. Miller staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief, then crumpled into the frost. The yard went still. The surviving riders looked at each other, then turned their horses and rode hard for the horizon. No one chased them. Carter leaned against the porch post, breathing hard, blood seeping through his shirt. Evan ran to him, panic in his voice. "You're hit!" "I've had worse," Carter said, wincing but managing a faint smile. "Check on Lydia and Anna." Evan hesitated, then nodded, running inside. Anna was already coming down the stairs, Lydia in her arms, eyes wide with fear. When she saw Carter still standing, she let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. They buried Miller on the edge of the property, no marker, no words. The wind carried the smell of pine and cold earth. That night the house was quiet again, but it was a different kind of quiet, not the heavy, suffocating silence of fear, but the stillness that comes after a storm. Evan sat by the fire, Lydia asleep against his side. Carter was in the chair opposite, his arm in a sling, watching the flames. "You didn't have to do it," Evan said finally. "Yeah," Carter replied, his voice rough. "I did." They sat in silence for a while, the fire popping softly. Evan looked at Lydia, then back at Carter. "So, what happens now?" Carter's gaze stayed on the fire. "Now? Now you stay. You work the land. You keep her safe. And when she's old enough, you tell her the truth, all of it. About your ma, about Miller, about the day you decided you weren't running anymore." Evan swallowed, feeling the weight of it. "And you?" Carter finally looked at him, and for the first time there was no guarded distance in his eyes. "I'll be here, long as you need me." Outside, the wind shifted, carrying the scent of wood smoke and the faint promise of spring. The land was still hard, the nights still cold, but something had changed. The boy who had arrived with nothing but fear now had a place. The man who had lived too long with ghosts now had a reason to stay. And in the quiet of that small house, with the fire burning low, the 3 of them began the slow, steady work of building something that might just last.